to the Web3 Prof Podcast.
Right, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm here with Magdalena Gronowska, who is a Bitcoin consultant. Thanks for being with me here today. Can we start things off by just talking about how did you get into Bitcoin? What's the story?
I am one of those of the number go up generation, right? Bitcoin price goes up. I'm like, what is this?
What year?
2017.
Oh, me too. Me too.
Yes, but did you get into ICOs and then lose all your
No,
money and then get back into the black in 2020? I feel like I'm almost like a 2020 generation. But I think, the touching the hot pan and burning yourself and learning is part of the experience why you go Bitcoin only.
Yeah. How did you, what was the reason that you got into Bitcoin?
I was just like, I saw the number go up and I started investing. And then that's the part. So as soon as you start owning Bitcoin, you then start to go down that rabbit hole, I think, because you're invested in it, right? And so I started because of number go up, but I stayed because I saw all the linkages kind of like to my life, whether it's because I came from the energy and carbon market space, right? So mining was just this natural fit, and it was like super exciting to see, this new financial legacy system connect right into like the hardcore, like we're building energy systems and we're optimizing energy systems. So there was that element. But then also from like a family perspective, my grandma lost her land. The government took it away because borders were shifted after the war in Poland. And so seeing, we call it, generational wealth. You might think like land and a house. That's what you pass on to your kids. That was just gone, poof, at the stroke of a pen. So sort of like family legacy and stories, and thinking about, everybody has their personal story, right? Mm-hmm. That connection. So for me, it was like this unconfiscatable asset. And my family too, like my parents left communist Poland with me. Everything was packed in tiny, like the tiniest car. It was called a Fiat car, like the brand name Fiat, not like money. And like all our belongings that we could take was there. And Bitcoin is this thing that you can cross borders with any amount of wealth. Yeah. And we were worried at the border, right? Like will they let us leave? And B, will they let us take, it's not like we had much, but will they let us take whatever we have? And so that's kind of like my personal story that kind of reinforced why Bitcoin to me.
Wow. And did they leave communist Russia or Poland to come to Canada?
And originally we were refugees in Germany for 2 years, and then we had a sponsor in Canada, a family member, so we came to Canada.
Wow, that's a remarkable story. I'm just interested, do your parents or does the older generation who was adults during that time, do they have any appreciation for Bitcoin from what you've seen? Or is it a technological barrier?
My dad was in IT, so I don't think it would have been as big a barrier for him. I think they tend to be a little bit more risk averse. Maybe it was because, they saw the hardships in communist Poland. So generally when it comes to that, there's just a general, risk aversion. But then at the same time too, when they were first generation, so I was kind of initially low income when we grew up, and then eventually they became middle class. So there's, but they never had that, because again, they grew up in communist Poland. There wasn't like these markets and equity funds, so investing wasn't a thing for them, right? Yeah. So it's I think I was the first generation to sort of start to understand that. But again, it wasn't school that taught me. It was self-directed, day trading because my coworkers were investing in stocks. So I think there's that big literacy issue in schools, right? What do they teach you? They teach you like how to sing, or they teach you geography, but they don't teach you the fundamentals to function as an adult.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. I got little kids in school, and that's exactly what it's like. So you're working on a book about the geopolitics, looking at Bitcoin and mining. So what do you think some of the biggest misconceptions are when it comes to Bitcoin mining and also financial security?
Yeah, so I think when it comes, the biggest misconception that's still kind of sticking around is Bitcoin uses a lot of energy, right? Whereas I think we have to turn it around, and Bitcoin is ushering in this era of energy abundance, right? And it's doing that by funding the infrastructure, funding both the fixing up of distribution transmission lines. We're seeing that in El Salvador, for example, but also more importantly, building out new generation. And we've seen that across all types of energy types, right? We're seeing miners co-locating or drawing from nuclear power. We're seeing renewables, whether that's in Texas, all the way to Africa. We are seeing the build out of flare gas, so on energy wells, right? And including some energy wells that are no longer profitable. But what mining is doing is because, so the process of mining, right? You have miners, they're verifying transactions, they're getting paid to secure the network, but also verify transactions. And so there's two kind of rewards. The biggest one is a coin-based reward, which is the block reward for finding a block. And then there's also the transaction fees. So if you want to do a transaction, I want to do transaction, we bid on how much we want to pay to have that transaction go, and then the miners pick which ones they want, and then they get paid to include that transaction in the next block. So that reward, the mining reward, is almost this third pocket, because traditionally energy systems are funded by taxpayers, especially large projects like nuclear, like massive hydro dams, and the second one is ratepayers, the folks that are using that energy system, right? Because they need to pay off all the infrastructure. And so now we have this third pocket like we've never had before, which is Bitcoin mining rewards. And so what I think, what really excites me is seeing this infrastructure get built out. And I think the coolest projects are those in Africa, where sub-Saharan Africa, I think is, in some places like 50 to 80% of it has no electricity, right? So you have villages that are completely disconnected. Kenya, I just visited Kenya, so I saw this with my own eyes in December. But so you have these villages that do not have access to power. They cannot, you go to sleep at night because there is no light. You can't study. The hospitals have to do surgery at night with candlelight. And if you knock over a candle, that's a big deal because, how do you do the surgery? And so what's happening there is there isn't sufficient, usually it comes down to, is there sufficient base to pay off this infrastructure, right? Especially in Africa. And there might not be, because it's one of those chicken and the egg problems. Mm-hmm. But what a Bitcoin miner does is it provides a predictable revenue stream, right? So 24/7, 365, there's a buyer that will always be buying that power. And because of that, that means that there's going to be a predictable revenue that a company that comes in says, okay, someone's going to buy it, so I'm willing to build because I can predict what my revenue will be. Or perhaps I might increase the capacity of what I was going to build because I know that capacity can be taken up. And that's happening, whether it's kind of scaling up what was going to be originally built or allowing that power to be built out. And the reason why I think Africa is so amazing is because we're used to turning on a switch and power's there, but we're actually changing people's lives there, right? They don't have to walk 2 hours a day to go get water. They can build pumping stations, right? I was talking about the medical needs of the community. And so I think, that's where it's most exciting, but it is happening also in Texas and the developing world, right? You have miners that are co-locating next to renewable plants, whether they're wind, whether they're solar, and they're subsidizing, right? They're providing a revenue stream because oftentimes where you build your solar plant, your wind plant is not necessarily where the population center is. It's where the wind blows, mm-hmm. right? And in some of those locations, you don't have the right wires. You don't have the transmission, distribution lines there, or they're insufficient capacity for the 200 megawatt plant. Mm-hmm. And so when you put the miner next door, maybe if you're transmission constrained, you're only able to send 50 to the next biggest city mm-hmm. across the transmission lines, but now suddenly you can utilize up to that 200. So I think that's sort of the most amazing part is it is building that out. And I think too, we're coming to this. So I mentioned, there was this worry about Bitcoin mining using all this energy. Mm. Well, now it's AI that's going to use all this energy, right?
Right.
We're going to more than double global energy for data centers by 2030 from right now, because AI is just like sopping it up everywhere. So I think that's kind of shifted. But what's really neat is the miners that have set up the infrastructure, these gigawatt facilities, for example, in Texas, some of them are actually converting that infrastructure to AI because it's a lot more profitable. But the point was that infrastructure was built out because of Bitcoin miners. And that will continue. Like, they'll be the pioneer species. They'll set up a new site, for example, on there's some companies that are also moving into the oil fields, right? So they're going to build the new generation. And once that's built, it might be converted, some of it. So then miners will keep moving because they're not like a traditional heavy industry where you have like a steel plant or a cement plant. And these things have, this big coke oven. Maybe it costs $30 million to build a kiln for a cement plant, 10 to 20 million. And these large pieces of infrastructure, they're stuck. You can't move them. But a Bitcoin miner, really, the most expensive part is that little machine. It's kind of looks like almost like a heater because it does output heat. And so that machine, you can move very easily because they're modular, right, to another site. Yes, there's some logistics involved, but you're not stuck like the cement plant or the steel plant or the car factory, right? And we saw that happen. So when China banned mining, I think it was 2021, half the global Bitcoin network went offline because there was so much mining in China.
Right.
But within like a couple of months, those miners all moved around the world. A lot of it went to the U.S. And so we saw that happen. And there's no other industry where this could happen. Yeah. And so I think that's pretty amazing.
That's fascinating. I was also recently in East Africa, and what was amazing to see was how energy impacts people's lives. So I was working with children with disabilities in hospitals in Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania. And in each hospital, what I saw quite frequently was burn victims, children who were there for plastic surgery because they were, significantly burned. And the way that this is often happening is they're using fire to cook in their hut, in their small one-room house. And young children fall into the fire. They may already have a disability, so they may not be able to move out of the fire, or they're very young. And the challenge is when you're dependent on cooking with fire, it's a pretty significant danger. Yeah. But an electrical solution solves that problem by allowing you to potentially have like a small burner to cook on and not having a fire, and maybe it's up on a table. And I think we can all logically acknowledge that that's probably a fairly significant step forward. Yeah. And with Bitcoin, adding to the electrical grid, it removes a significant problem for people. It's obvious that it's not ideal to be cooking with fire. It's pretty inefficient. It takes a lot of time. You have to collect wood. You got to cut down trees. You have to do all these things. And so the movement out of that is pretty powerful. And it impacts like the lives of little children, which is pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, what you're speaking about is quite powerful. I think one thing that I've learned so much about in interviewing people like yourself who talk about energy is that one of the most significant ways to move people out of poverty is to give them electricity. Yeah. That is a key first step. And in so much of, like you said, sub-Saharan Africa and many other places in the world, like there's just no opportunities to have electricity. Well,
and another story that I really love to tell is that of Virunga National Park. It's a park in the Congo that historically 99% of its funding came from tourism, and 1% came from government. But when COVID hit, tourism died. And then on top of that, a lot of gorillas
yes,
moved into the area, and it became very dangerous, and it still is very dangerous. So despite COVID being over, it's too dangerous to visit now. And so Virunga has gorillas. The
animals.
The animals. And so part of what the park rangers do is they protect them from poaching. And it was very prescient by the park director he actually started looking at Bitcoin mining around 2019. and he reached out to a French national because, most of, or a lot of Africa speaks French. They're under the, formerly under French rule, sort of still kind of. It's a touchy subject. Yes. Read Alex Gladstein's work on that. I think it documents it really well. But anyways, so he reached out to Sebastian, and they set up Bitcoin mining in the park. And through the act of that, they also kind of shored up the, built out additional infrastructure like hydro generating capacity. And then they built out a road network and water pumping stations. And because of that, there was economic effects felt downstream because suddenly there's power and more power, right? There's roads, there's water. A lot more people moved to the area, including businesses. So a textile mill, which started hiring local workers. There's not a lot of job opportunities. Actually, the rate of, what's the rate when unemployment rate is quite high in the area, right? So people do things like guerrilla, they become mercenaries, right? Yeah. And it's dangerous work, and it's not, like they kill people, they steal. And so by offering, jobs at traditional kind of like textile mills, for example, it helps build up the community, and it takes family members away from sort of this life of crime. So you're seeing this good. And I think the coolest part though is like the Bitcoin mining is providing like $150,000 per month in revenue to the park. So it is actually helping, preserve gorillas, helping preserve the park, because they have to fight constantly against exploitation of other resources from the park. So I think that's sort of like the best news story that I have heard sort of coming from Africa. And remember when I said miners are kind of like little heaters? Mm-hmm. Like they exude a lot of heat. They're almost better than traditional heaters. Yeah. So they're taking the heat from the miners and cycling it through to dry fruit, to dry cocoa beans. And so instead, so they process the cocoa beans on site. Instead of sending it to France, they make chocolate, to be sold. So all that value added stuff that usually happens in like Belgium or France, right? That stays in Africa, right? That benefits Africa. So I think that's such a beautiful story. And then also like the farmers, because it takes them 2 to 3 weeks to dry the cocoa beans out on their farms. Mm-hmm. But mercenaries come in, and sometimes they slaughter the farmers, steal their cocoa beans. So they're actually, in a way, saving lives, because it only takes a day to dry the cocoa beans when the farmer takes, his wet beans to the site. So I think it's just such a beautiful story of everything sort of coming together and that economic development benefit. And that's why, yes, we talk about all the good things that mining is doing in North America, but it's places like this where I think it's having like an outsized impact. And those are the stories that I want to push forward.
My next question was to ask you, what are some of the surprising insights you've gained from traveling to places like this? You've been to El Salvador and I think Paraguay as well. I mean, I think you've given us some great insights already. I mean, but that's pretty remarkable. The fact that, coffee beans or cocoa beans or fruit can be dried with the excess heat. I've actually not heard that aspect of the story in the Congo, and I think that's pretty remarkable. It also feeds people, gives people employment, and builds efficiencies into the marketplace to hold value in the continent instead of sending it to Europe. Yeah,
so then they're building out more plants like that too, where they're drying fruit and retaining sort of the revenue. So I think everybody should travel, right, to developing countries, if not only to humble yourself.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Because you think about your day and you're like, oh, what a crappy day I had. It's like, no, like you go there and you become very quickly humbled about how lucky you are. Right. Even just looking at the electrical infrastructure, sometimes it's like this big rat's nest and you're wondering like, how is this like transformer not blown up? Right. Yeah. Like even in El Salvador, there was a lot of like blackouts and brownouts, and I experienced them myself. That said, I know, so like Bitcoin Beach, right, regularly had blackouts and brownouts. And recently, I believe as of April, they were shoring up all the electrical infrastructure up until El Zante. And that was part of the in collaboration with Volcano Energy, which is the big mining outfit that's kind of partnered with government. It's a JV, a joint venture with the government of El Salvador. So they're mining Bitcoin. So we are actually legitimately seeing, nation state mining in a way, and then B, shoring up infrastructure, existing electrical infrastructure that's benefiting the rest of like all other ratepayers. And I think that's important. That's another story that we need to tell. And then obviously there's like the third part, which is like the energy optimization, which we can get into later. But I think the most important thing is just traveling to these countries, and even simple things like you want to buy something from a street vendor, and this is not energy related, but it's more like Bitcoin related. A lot of times, you're carrying US dollars, and banks traditionally, they give us like $10 bills, 20 US dollar bills, $100 bills. You go to a vendor, I remember I was once, in Peru, also very, very poor. Same thing in Kenya, and you give them like a $20 bill. They cannot issue you change, right? Like $20 is so much money for them. And it's almost like a thing of dignity, because then they have to go to their friends and scrabble together and like, I owe you this amount of money. And I think one of the, like my aha experience moments was when I went to El Salvador, I went to a beach and I wanted to buy a coconut, right? It's $2. And I didn't have like small change, but I'm like, hey, do you accept Bitcoin? They're like, yeah, I do. And I could give them the exact amount. Right. And I think that's kind of transformatory, because they don't have to scrabble for change. So something like as simple as that is, giving back some dignity is pretty incredible, because, we're all like, oh yeah, we're going to take our USD or traveler's checks. Well, if you actually want to get out and experience like the real culture and what it's like, how are you going to pay for things?
Yeah, that's great. You advise PRTI, which turns tires into energy and relates to Bitcoin. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. This is one of those moments where I kind of like I circled back, so I studied, environmental science in university. So it's like, how did you end up in Bitcoin? Now you're like working, I helped launch the first Bitcoin fund in Canada, which is like completely separate. And if you think about it, but this is one of those moments where I came back because I actually worked on waste regulations in Ontario to enable large final emitters, or like heavy industry, whether it's steel, cement, to use waste. Like change the regulatory framework, and waste like tires is one of them. So I saw that there was a company that was using waste tires, and I got really interested, and it led to an advisory role. What they do is they take the tire and they put it in a vertical reactor, and it's essentially like baking the tire. And it's almost like a reverse reaction to when you make the tire, where it's putting it back into its original components, because the tire is petroleum, steel for structural integrity, and rubber. A lot of it is rubber, right? Because wheels take a pounding, right? So you have to have that. And so when you put it in the vertical reactor, bake it for about 11 hours, what comes out is we tap off oil, we tap off synthetic gas, like natural gas that has BTU content. There is a black carbon that's coming from the rubber that also has BTU value, though, that another industrial company buys it and uses it kind of like coal. And then there's steel that's sold for scrap. So we get paid. This is the coolest part. It's like we get paid for the waste, because when you throw something out, you pay a tipping fee to put it in the landfill. And we have 4 saleable products that at any point we can either sell or upgrade. For example, the oil can be upgraded to other value-added products if it's not economic to mine, for example. And then, the steel we sell for scrap. So this is kind of an example of an integrated miner where we make our own energy. But also, there's a bigger infrastructure component, because you have to build up both the energy infrastructure and the mining, right? So it's a different model, right? Different mining companies have different models, but it's neat because it has obviously, different type of environmental impact, where you're getting rid of waste. There's about 1 billion tires thrown out every year, not to mention all the tires in landfills. Like in Kuwait, there are literally like a desert filled of tires that are burning.
Really?
Yeah, because they caught fire and they're just like the chain reaction. So I think
this has just been going on?
Yeah. There are a lot of landfill fires, actually. There's some, I remember looking into it for my book, just to sort of like give context, but there were like a number of fires where there was like over 1 million tires that were like stockpiled that just caught fire for whatever reason. And yeah, it's not great. It's a lot of toxic.
How long do these fires last?
They can last for a long time. Like, I'm also a volunteer firefighter, right? Like, it's a lot of fuel. You have to put a lot of water on that. And then, but think about it, like you're putting water on and it's like leaching toxins as you're putting it out.
Right.
It's just a bad scenario. So I think it's kind of cool. Like, Bitcoin fixes this. Yeah, it helps build out renewables. It helps get rid of waste. It's pretty neat.
So, sorry, can you tie, what is the relationship with PRTI and Bitcoin mining?
Oh, okay. So
I don't quite understand the relationship.
Yeah. So as I was saying, if you're a miner, what do you need? You need to build out the mining side, the mining equipment, but you also need power. Mm-hmm. So either you buy power, right? So you have to negotiate a power purchase agreement, or you just hook into the grid, which is typically more expensive than some sort of like one-off contract, or you build your own power. Right. Mm-hmm. So some miners are doing that. They're building or they're buying like a wind farm, but we build reactors that take waste into energy and we burn so that oil that taps off, we can put in a diesel generator.
I see.
And burn it to power miners. So there's a turbine and it generates power. So that's sort of like a different kind of model where we are generating our own power. And there's many other cases, but like with different fuel sources.
And so they've not only able to be profitable from the process of processing the tires, but now they're able to use that energy to also mine Bitcoin and have additional revenue streams from the recycling tire process. Yeah. So you can sell the steel, you get paid for the power, but so your operating costs are lower because about 80% of a mining operation, the cost of the operating cost is energy, right? It's the biggest impact. And so, because it's where we're getting paid for our power, it's different. But at the other side, there's also the capital cost component, which rises if you're building your own out. Yeah. Okay. That's fascinating. What are your thoughts on the government of Canada, or maybe governments in general, holding Bitcoin on their reserve? Yeah.
So I think it's like we are in the time where sovereign nations are A, mining Bitcoin, and B, either setting up or contemplating setting up strategic Bitcoin reserves. I mean, the U.S. has signaled, right? Trump signaled that he's setting up a Bitcoin strategic stockpile, that they're not going to be selling their Bitcoin and they're potentially going to be acquiring. And I think the U.S., like when El Salvador did it, like it was incredible that they started buying and holding Bitcoin. But when, when the rest of the world tends to look at the U.S. in a different way, when the U.S. says that, then I think a lot more wheels start to turn. Yeah. And Bhutan, I do want to mention Bhutan because they have been mining since 2019. They have mined over $1 billion worth of Bitcoin, and they've been selling. I think their peak was about 12,500 Bitcoin, and then last I looked, it was like 7,500. So they've been selling their Bitcoin, but they're doing a lot of transformation within their country. They're building a massive airport, another city to try to attract both tourism and tech to them. So they're actually using it to benefit their society, which I think is pretty amazing, right? Like they're using it just like any other currency, right? They're acquiring this resource. So I think whether the nation decides to buy or to mine because they have some sort of competitive advantage. Like Bhutan, for example, they have a lot of excess power that they traditionally sell and sometimes like at a loss to neighboring states. So it makes a lot more sense for them to use that excess power, a lot of hydro, to mine Bitcoin. And so they go from a nation that maybe is not blessed with the traditional resources that we think of that enrich a nation. They don't have massive oil reserves, gold, rare earth metals, but they have power. So I think it is a way to accumulate, a very credible way, is to use this stranded power, this excess power, to acquire a different type of scarce digital asset. And I think that's pretty incredible. And then other nations might decide to do it for various reasons, right? If you look at what's happening with all the trade tension and trade chaos, we're seeing a lot more bilateral and multilateral agreements that are kind of moving away from US dollar denominated trade, like China and Russia and India, right? They're working on various other agreements, for example, for trading for oil for the yuan, right? Oil for Russian rubles or for Bitcoin. So I think we're moving away and that shift. So if you have a strategic stockpile as a country, you can you kind of have this whole unstoppable trade, right? So the U.S. tends to weaponize the traditional financial system, SWIFT being one of those things. And when, Russia did what they did, right, when the whole war on Ukraine, what ended up happening is a lot of countries sanctioned Russia and cut them off from the SWIFT system. So you cannot connect to Russian banks. Businesses, including not just in Russia, but also Belarus, which is kind of next door, they stop being able to do global trade, global commerce. But if you have some sort of unstoppable money like Bitcoin, right, and you have a stockpile so that you can pay for resources around the globe, so you're enabling global commerce, then you're kind of ahead. And secondly, I think mining is that critical component. Yes, you can have a stockpile, and that's super important, but that stockpile in a way is worthless if you cannot transact. And that's where mining comes in, right? So one, you need enough hash power, as in enough compute power, so the miners, within your country to be able to take transactions of your citizens, of your government, but you need enough hash power so that they can find a block. So maybe even if it's like a block a day that's found within your country, that helps. And secondly, you need to have either your own sovereign mining pool or almost like strategic alliances or agreements with mining pools, because the mining pools are the ones that create the top block templates. They're the ones who pick which transactions go. And the miners just kind of like are workers, and the pool is the one who decides. So if you control the pool or have an agreement, you can then say, if you have A, enough hash power to find the block, but B, those miners are like, yes, we want these specific transactions from the citizens. That is the combination that will allow your country to stay sovereign, right? To continue to do global trade, and it's uncensorable, right? You cannot stop that Bitcoin transaction from happening if miners make sure that it happens. So I think that's sort of the important part is, yes, you can have your stockpile, but more importantly, you need the hash power and the block space through the mining pools to make those transactions happen. So I think that's sort of the key part there.
So what do you say to people who are like, well, if Russia can use Bitcoin and we think Russia's bad, now we can't stop them from global trade. We want to have that decision. We want to be able to control these countries in which we think are bad actors. And now Bitcoin just allows them to participate in the economy. What's the argument there to say that, no, actually, they should be able to participate or whichever?
Yeah. Well, it's one of those things where, like Bitcoin's for everyone, but it's also for your enemy. But one of those days, maybe you're the enemy. All right. So like if Canada is all, oh, darn, Russia's transacting. Well, look at what just happened with the U.S., right? We had huge tariffs come in. And what if at some point the U.S. is like, you know what? I'm sick of you, Canada. We're just cutting you off from SWIFT, right? Like we could be in that same situation, no different than the Canadian truckers that protested against COVID lockdowns and people that donated money to the truckers that were just, like single moms, that then the Canadian government came in and shut them off from the Canadian financial system. Like, you don't think it's you until one day you're cut off. So it's not, impossible to believe that maybe your country one day will not be shut off. So I think you're better off allowing those rails to happen. They're going to figure out a way anyway. Maybe it will be gold. Maybe it'll be bilateral agreements with like China and Russia. It's still going to be happening. So I think like, I like the world where we have an option.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting because we see so many people kind of make this argument and when you say, well, you could be the victim of this next. And I think it's hard for most people in Western countries to realize until maybe you put it in the context of Donald Trump, which a lot of people They don't like him. And you could imagine a world where Donald Trump may make you the bad actor.
Yeah.
And say that like he's kind of doing with Canada right now, right? As us as a nation. And Donald Trump is one of many controversial leaders in society that you could think, well, maybe they would do that, whether you like them or not.
Yeah.
It's really a question of like, do you want to have the freedom and the sovereignty to make your own financial decisions, or do you want to leave that in the hands of a centralized authority who today you might trust, but maybe not tomorrow?
Exactly.
Right. And we see political shifts all the time, like the shifting sands of the Sahara. And so today we might say, yeah, we trust these people, but I don't know that anybody can really say that they definitively are going to always trust the centralized authority in the place in which they come from. And we can look at countries all over the world who have dictators and regimes, and also free societies who have leaders who some parts of society think are dictators and regimes. Like there's a whole part of the United States that thinks Donald Trump is a dictator, right? And so those people should participate in the Bitcoin economy, because if they really believe that, he could shut them down. Yeah. If they really think he is actually a communist dictator.
It's really ironic because it's actually like the Democrats who are against him, and they're the ones who like want to shut down Bitcoin.
I know, right? Yeah. Yeah, and if they were pro-Bitcoin, they could actually defend themselves from being alienated from society, from a potential dictator or warlord or whatever it is. And so what I think is really important about this conversation is that we're talking about, like, how does Bitcoin support the underdog? How does Bitcoin help the developing country or the impoverished people within that developing country? And I think this is a really powerful and important narrative that we need to explore deeply to allow people who are compassionate people, who care about people who are marginalized, to understand that Bitcoin is not like a get-rich-quick scheme in the way that both you and I got involved. Yeah. You know, when you and I started,
get rich and maybe you got burned, but yes.
Yeah, like we thought, okay, well, it's just going to go up. And in 2017, I bought it at like, I think I bought it like 2 days before the top or something, you know, and endured the pain. And now I think I've realized since then, over the years and talking to people like yourselves, that, well, there's a real poverty relief effort here that Bitcoin can really assist in. And that's such a powerful story that I think we need to continue to talk about. So I'd like to hear more about the government's scrutiny on Bitcoin mining.
Yeah.
Here in British Columbia, we have kind of a moratorium on large mining. Yes. And you know, there's a lot of confusion about that, even what that actually means in our province. But tell us about government regulation and scrutiny on Bitcoin mining, especially around energy use.
Yeah. And so it's kind of frustrating because there is a lot of good that we've seen and a lot of studies that came out. So Texas, for example, like they're sort of a very localized grid. They have a grid called ERCOT, and the ERCOT has done studies to show how beneficial Bitcoin mining has been, because miners are the perfect demand response vehicle. So if the grid is over, if there's too much demand on the grid for power, they can issue, there's a price signal. Price starts to ramp up because more expensive generation comes online. But miners are perfect because they can just shut off on a dime. Like basically you push a button and every single miner shuts off. You can't really do that for traditional heavy industry, right? If you have an auto manufacturing plant, maybe you need to keep that shift going. You can't have a batch of chemicals spoil, so you can't just like turn it off very quickly. But miners are sort of that perfect demand response. AI or traditional data centers that are storing data, you cannot shut down and prevent your customers from accessing their data, right? So it's a very different type of miner. And so when there were these massive storms or even the eclipse in Texas, miners just shut off, right? And it's almost like they exist as these virtual power plants. So when, if there's like 4 gigawatts of miners in Texas, let's say, it's like a virtual power plant of 4 gigawatts that when the winter storm took out power across the grid, it's a kind of like a complex reason why some of the generators came offline. But the point was they shut off, and hospitals, schools continued to get power because, they didn't shut off, but the miners did. And they provided that for or whatever amount of gigawatts of energy. And so we have to kind of remember that, right? They help make that grid better. And so, but there's still sort of that misconception, right? Governments here don't see that they could help subsidize that infrastructure. And it's very frustrating because they actually see them as almost like especially British Columbia, like that their biggest concern is we want to electrify everything, right? All vehicles, 2030. And so they see them competing, like miners for power, competing with all these other electrification things, whereas it could actually be helping build that out and subsidizing the whole provincial rate base. And it does get complicated because in Canada and the US, it's the states and the provinces that set local power laws. It's not done federally, right? What's federal would be things like transmission lines or gas pipelines that are crossing multiple provincial boundaries, but the actual power generation is very localized. And so there's a lot, so Alberta, they love Bitcoin. Right. They're trying to attract miners. They have trade missions to Texas with sending miners and back and forth. Right. It's very different, to the neighbor, which is us, where there's that moratorium. Like it's such a different space. So I think but there's the education component still. And then I think too, it's unfortunately still very partisan, right? The left, for some reason or another, still really hates Bitcoin. It thinks it's going to kill the environment, whereas I see it as benefiting the environment. Here's the thing. So there's all these, the left tends to have climate goals a lot, right? And I came from carbon markets, right? I helped put in cap and trade between British Columbia, California, Quebec, and Ontario. And that's a pricing signal. But meanwhile, they fail to notice, some of the largest emitters that are harder to control are landfills, right? Because you throw out waste, it's biological. As it degrades, it emits methane. And methane is 84 times more potent greenhouse gas than CO2, carbon dioxide, over 100-year lifespan. And so you have all these landfills and there's, as regulations, so the regulatory framework usually has that by 2030 or 40 or 50, every landfill has to be capped and then that methane has to be flared. Well, who's going to pay for that, right? Somebody has to pay for it. Either it's a government subsidizing through an incentive to build that infrastructure to capture that gas, or tipping fees will go up. Users will pay more for the waste and, that hits us all in the pocketbook. Well, guess what? There's that third pocket again, right? You can have a Bitcoin miner co-locate on a landfill that helps support the building out of, let's say $2 million infrastructure of the gas capture and then the combustion system. And so you can situate miners either to buy or the landfill can set up its own miners. And you are converting something that's 84 times more potent to 1 times, right? Yes. From methane to CO2. And that means that process is carbon negative, not carbon neutral, not we're zeroing out. It is negative. So the whole mining network by Daniel Batten did some studies. I can't remember if it was 36 landfills or something. It was not a lot of landfills, large landfills. If they were converted to methane, they could zero out the entire Bitcoin network's impact, right? Oh, wow. We're at about over 50% carbon, is on renewables, but we could completely eliminate all emissions just by catching more methane. Wow. And so, and it's not just landfills, it's gas wells that are just flaring gas. It's farms, right? There's a lot of waste pig manure, cow, or just waste residue. Same thing, you can put it in an anaerobic digester, methane can be captured, you can, get rid of that methane by burning it. So there is a huge positive environmental story, and that these governments that are so left that want to reduce carbon emissions still, they could just really jump on that bandwagon. And the other big thing too is heat. Most of our heating is carbon-based, right? It's propane, it's natural gas in homes, or if you're heating your water, right? Well, if you stick in a little miner, a little heater, And there's so many amazing companies that are either, creating like water heaters that have miners integrated in them, or like all these home tinkerers, there's this whole home mining movement where people are building home heating systems, whether it's just a simple putting a miner in your home, like in a room, or actually integrating it into your central air system, especially in Canada, because it's a lot more colder here. So you're heating it through the miner, but you're basically electrifying your heating because you're moving from natural gas to electricity, which in most cases has renewables in the grid. And in our case here in BC, it's like 98% renewable. So, like BC's against mining. Well, there's a big benefit. You're actually electrifying things. And I think that's the story that needs to continue to be told.
Yeah, that's great. I have one more question for you. So where do you see looking ahead in 5 to 10 years when we look at Bitcoin mining, both from a technological perspective or a geopolitical perspective? What do you think it's going to look like?
I'll start with the geopolitics. I do think more nation states will either announce that they've been mining or get into mining. And I think like it's an issue of national security. Like I know people throw that around a lot, but I really do, because if you want to transact, if you want uncensorable money to continue to do global commerce, you have to get into the mining game. You need to make sure that you attract enough hash rate to your country. And Canada, by the way, has been losing hash rate. We went from 13% of global hash rate in about, I think 2020 or 2021 to right now we're at about 3%.
Oh, wow.
I mean, it's still, if you look at it as like a GDP, how much GDP does Canada have versus global GDP? We're about 2%. So we're still a little bit better, and Bob Burnett, I believe, is the one who said every country should try to aim to have like enough hash rate in their country that's equivalent to their GDP. And I think that makes a lot of sense. So we're still above it for Canada, but we're losing ground, right? Like Latin America, Africa, mining is moving there. And I think they're going to take up some additional. So like, come on, Canada. You need to do that. So I think, and then, more sort of sovereign mining pools, if not something like, we have these strategic alliances like NATO, right? That is all about protection. We have, and then World Trade Organization, ensuring that global commerce can happen. So I think like there will be these agreements that are on par with these that are mining agreements between sovereign states. So I think that's kind of where that world is heading. And then that's, obviously, if you don't, it's a lot harder politically, I think, to say, oh, we're buying $1 billion worth of Bitcoin, because everyone's like, oh, where's this money coming from? It's so risky, because, the traditional public just does not understand Bitcoin, right? So it's a lot easier to sort of get into nation state mining. I think it's easier than like saying, oh, we're selling all our gold to mine Bitcoin. So I think that's where that is going. And then globally, I do think we're still going to see that hash rate shift to these places in the world where there's abundant energy, but it's grid disconnected, right? And partly too, because AI, because you can make so much more money per gigawatt or per megawatt, whatever your unit account is of energy, if you're into AI at this point, so that those places that have centralized, very well connected power that also has very good energy, internet infrastructure, because you have to have very low latency for AI. So I think those will get converted. So I think mining will continue to move to the edges, and it will continue to integrate, whether it's heating, right? There's so many applications, pools, homes, everything could be heated, like greenhouses, right? So we'll see a lot more of that, and so maybe like smaller scale distributed mining. So I think that's sort of where we're headed, and then AI will take those larger sites that are existing, and mining will be that pioneer species, and then eventually it'll move to the next site.
Yeah, that's great. Oh, I love that. I appreciate your perspective on this. Megs, just before we end, where can people find out more about you?
Yeah. So I am on X or Twitter, crypto_Megs. I guess LinkedIn is for the TradFi folks. I'm just about to spin sort of up a website, because I think I need to consolidate everything. I'm also on Nostr though, so I think it's on my Twitter. I think you can see where I am on Nostr. If you're into that unstoppable social media, unstoppable money, that's kind of where I think the world's headed.
Okay, that's great. Thanks so much, Megs. I really appreciate you being with me.
Thank you.